My name is Danielle Prescott. I am 26 years old, and the night my stepmother screamed at me to hand over my own bedroom to her son, in the house my late parents built with their own hands, something in me went completely still, because I finally understood that no amount of quiet sacrifice was ever going to earn me a place in that family. So before I tell you what I did in the 3 weeks that followed, and what she found waiting for her when she finally opened the envelope from my attorney, tell me this. Have you ever given everything to people who were only waiting for the moment you had nothing left to give? Welcome to Hearthly Stories, where the quiet ones finally learn their own strength. It happened on a Sunday evening, the kind of ordinary dinner that had become almost unbearable in the 2 years since my father died. My stepmother Carla slammed her fork down so hard it rattled the plates and looked straight at me across the table. My mother had once said every single night of my childhood, either you give your room to Tyler or you pack your bags and get out, she shouted it. Right there, in front of the framed photograph of my father still hanging crookedly on the wall behind her, a photograph she had never once bothered to straighten. Tyler, her 19-year-old son, sat beside her with a small, satisfied smirk, like he'd already picked out where he was going to put his gaming console. Nobody at that table said a word in my defense. Not my aunt visiting from out of town. Not even the silence of my father's own memory seemed to matter anymore. And I realized, in that exact moment, that I had spent 2 years quietly funding a household that had already erased me. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply set my napkin down, looked at her with a calm I didn't know I still had left in me, and said, okay, I'll pack my bags. What none of them understood, sitting there feeling victorious, was that I had been preparing for this moment far longer than they realized. If stories about quiet strength and long overdue justice speak to you, stay with me, because what happened over the following weeks changed everything. To understand why that dinner broke something in me, you have to understand what that house actually meant. My parents built it together, room by room, weekend by weekend, back when I was young enough to remember my mother painting the kitchen a soft yellow, because she said mornings deserved something cheerful. She passed away when I was 19, and for years after that it was just my father and me, learning how to be a family of two. But he remarried when I was 23, and at first I told myself I could make room in my heart for Carla, for her sake and for his. I tried, genuinely tried for 2 entire years. But grief has a way of revealing who people really are. And when my father passed suddenly 18 months ago, from a heart condition none of us saw coming, Carla's grief seemed to fade remarkably fast, replaced by something that looked a great deal like ownership. I was working as a financial analyst downtown by then, a steady, demanding job I had built for myself, while still living at home to help care for my father in his final year. And after he died, I simply kept paying the property taxes, the roof repair after a bad storm, the electric bill every single month, because some quiet, aching part of me believed that keeping that house running was the same thing as keeping my father's memory alive. Carla and Tyler lived there without contributing a single dollar, and somewhere along the way, my quiet generosity turned, in her mind, into an obligation she was entitled to. That Sunday night wasn't really about a bedroom. It was the moment she finally said out loud what she'd clearly been thinking for months, that I was disposable in a house I had spent 2 years holding together. I drove away that night with 2 suitcases in my trunk, and instead of falling apart, I felt something unexpected settle over me, a strange, clean kind of clarity. I checked into a small hotel downtown, and sitting on the edge of that unfamiliar bed, I opened my laptop and did the one thing I actually knew how to do when everything else felt uncertain. I looked at the numbers. I had almost $200,000 saved, quietly, carefully, over years of discipline, money Carla had no idea existed, because I had learned a long time ago never to hand people a full picture of your life if they hadn't earned the right to see it. My closest friend Renee, been sending me listings for months, gently nudging me to stop pouring my life into a house that no longer felt like mine. One listing kept catching my eye, a small 2-story home on a quiet hillside just outside the city, surrounded by trees, with a wide porch that reminded me achingly of the one my father used to sit on with his morning coffee. That night, for the first time in years, I let myself imagine a life that didn't revolve around managing someone else's comfort. The next morning, I walked through that house with Renee beside me, and standing in the sunlit living room, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Permission. Permission to want something, just for myself. 5 days later, I signed the papers, and when the agent handed me the keys, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, unfamiliar sensation of finally building something that belonged entirely to me. That same week, I sat down with an estate attorney named Marcus Whitfield, a steady, no-nonsense man who had handled property disputes for over 20 years. I brought him the deed to my parents' house, my father's death certificate, and 18 months of quiet resentment I finally let myself put into words. He listened carefully, and then he told me something that changed the entire shape of what came next. Because my father died without a formal will separating that property, the law considered me a rightful co-owner of that house. Not a guest, not a tenant, an actual legal owner with real enforceable rights. Carla had spent 18 months acting like a queen inside a castle. She never actually owned a loan, and she had no idea. Hearing that, something in my chest finally loosened. Because for 2 years I had felt powerless in that house, and it turned out I had held real ground the entire time. I just hadn't known it. Marcus explained that I could formally demand she either buy out my share of the home within a set window of time, or the property would be sold and the proceeds divided fairly between us. And given everything I already knew about her finances, or rather her complete lack of any real income, I understood immediately which outcome was coming. I asked him to prepare the paperwork, and for the first time since that dinner, I felt something other than grief. I felt ground beneath my feet again. 4 days after I moved into my new home, my phone buzzed with a message from Carla, casual, entitled, as if nothing had happened, asking me to send over money for Tyler's upcoming birthday celebration. Steaks, imported wine, an expensive cake. Like the scene at that dinner table had simply evaporated from her memory. I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling something cold and clear settle over the last bit of guilt I'd been carrying, and I typed back 4 words. You can cover it. Then I opened my banking app and remembered something I'd nearly forgotten in the chaos of moving. Months earlier, during my father's illness, I had added both Carla and Tyler as authorized users on one of my credit cards, purely for emergencies, and in the emotional blur of losing him, I had simply never removed them. With a few taps, I revoked their access completely, cutting off a financial lifeline they had clearly been quietly relying on for far longer than I realized. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. Tyler, furious, humiliated, standing at some checkout counter with a decline card in his hand, shouting that I was sabotaging his birthday. I let him finish, and then, calmly, I told him there had been no glitch, that my support for their lifestyle was simply over, and I hung up while he was still yelling. Carla called minutes later, her voice sharp with rage, accusing me of abandoning my responsibilities, threatening, absurdly, to call the police. I laughed. Not out of cruelty, but out of sheer disbelief, and reminded her that the house belonged to my father's estate, not to her personal kingdom. Then I hung up, and said nothing about the letter that was already on its way to her front door. That letter arrived on a gray, rainy Thursday afternoon. Official, formal, undeniable, laying out in plain legal language that I held a rightful half-share ownership in that home, and that she had 30 days to either buy out my portion or agree to sell. I imagined the moment she read it, because within hours her tone had transformed entirely. The woman who had screamed at me across a dinner table was suddenly leaving tearful voicemail after tearful voicemail, calling it all a misunderstanding, promising Tyler would gladly take the smaller room now, begging me to talk privately, instead of letting lawyers handle it. I sat on my new porch, listening to the rain drift over the trees, and I let every single message play out without a shred of guilt, because I finally understood something that had taken me 26 years to learn. People only discover the value of what they had once they're terrified of losing it. By Friday, her desperation had turned into a request for a face-to-face meeting, and I agreed on my terms at a public coffee shop with my attorney present, because I was done having private conversations that she could later twist into something softer than the truth. That Saturday morning, Carla and Tyler sat across from me, and true to form, she began weeping before we'd even ordered coffee, calling me heartless, ungrateful, accusing me of throwing a grieving widow into the street. A few nearby customers glanced over, but Marcus simply opened his folder and laid out the truth in calm, unshakable detail. The deed, the payments I had made alone for 2 years, the legal reality she had refused to accept. Her performance crumbled almost instantly under the weight of documentation she couldn't argue with. And before she could recover, I turned to Tyler and told him, evenly, that the car he'd been driving for 2 years was registered entirely under my name, and that I was ending that arrangement immediately. He went pale, sputtering that he needed it for work, and I simply asked for the keys. After a long, furious silence, he set them on the table. And something in his expression told me he finally understood that the comfortable life he'd taken for granted had quietly belonged to me the entire time. 3 weeks later, the house sold, and once my rightful share was settled, what remained for Carla wasn't nearly enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd built on my quiet generosity. Without steady income or credit, she and Tyler ended up in a small, worn-down apartment across town. Devastating fall from the comfortable home she'd once ruled like her own own personal palace, and almost immediately, the peace they'd never had to earn began collapsing entirely. Tyler blamed her bitterly for losing the house, the car, the easy life, and Carla, desperate and humbled, began sending me long, pleading messages asking for financial help, framing it as family loyalty. I read every single one sitting peacefully in my own home, and felt nothing but quiet, steady resolve. Then I blocked her number and his for good. 3 months later, I sat on my own porch with Renee, coffee in hand, watching the morning light spread gently across the hills, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, real, unshakable peace. Marcus had mentioned, in a brief update, that Tyler had dropped out of school to work full-time just to cover rent, and that Carla was working exhausting shifts just to keep a roof over their heads, and I felt no satisfaction in their struggle, only a quiet, settled understanding that consequences had simply caught up to choices that were never mine to fix. I thought about my father often in those quiet mornings, and I knew without any doubt that he would be proud, not of the house, not of the money, but of the fact that I had finally learned to protect myself, that his legacy had never been meant to fund people who saw me as an inconvenience. It was meant to give me the strength to build a life that was entirely unapologetically my own. I took a slow sip of coffee, looked out over the hills that were now mine, and felt for the first time in years completely peacefully free. Thank you for watching another emotional journey on Hearthly Stories. Every story on this channel is a fictional work created for entertainment and reflection. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join Hearthly Stories for more unforgettable family drama and stories of courage, justice, and self-respect.